Thank you, Jim. I think this audience probably will like a little bit better what I have to say than the last audience that I did after dinner. That was an after dinner speech. The last after dinner speech I did was actually to a group of World Bank officials and United Nations officials at Cornell University. Just after we had had a meal of filet mignon. Rather difficult, to say the least. I'm really pleased to be here in this audience. It's really quite a special occasion for me because the last time that I had addressed this group, I think was about 4 or 5 years ago in Hofstra. And at that time, I was somewhat reluctant to come in spite of Jerry Deutsch's encouragement, partly because I had just been then at that time experiencing a neurological difficulty with my speech, and I still unfortunately have a bit of it, so if I slur, you understand what it is. I've since learned that probably it's related to my discovery of dioxin, the Agent Orange, some many years ago. In any case, at that time, I came and gave a talk, and I have to say that this society has been kinder to me than any society I've known, because Jerry had encouraged me to come because he had thought that, in fact, there would be some people in this audience that might be able to help me in my neurological problem with my speech. And so very kindly after that, I think about 8 or 9 people got together to talk to me and offered me an opportunity to go and do something different and new that I hadn't occasioned before. Namely, they had arranged for me to go out and spend some time with Alan Goldhammer, who all of you heard today. And so I met Alan for the first time and had a fantastic experience with Alan. He was very kind, he and his staff and Jennifer. And I have to say at that time also, having been in sort of establishment science for so long, and learning a bit about what somebody else was doing outside of the, if you will, at least establishment science thinks it's outside, I think it's sort of inside. But to learn about this whole area of hygienic practices and the results that one gets really opened up for me a whole new world. And I have to say that the education I got with Alan at the time really has had a dramatic impact, at least on my thinking, and I hope on some of my colleagues as we've tried to interpret the China data. Actually, I think Jim made a comment about the question concerning the importance of science for this field. And this is something that I really hold rather dear. And I would like to ask you to consider with me what science really does and doesn't do to support this area of work. The last time that I gave a talk, I think it was about a month or so ago in Maine, to a vegetarian group, in fact, I got a letter, someone after that, a very kind letter, somebody offering to get together with me and write a book. But in the process, he mentioned to me that, or asked me, why is it that we scientists tend to think that we have to tell vegetarians, if you will, all about the importance of this particular field? Why do we have to justify it in terms of science? He went on to point out that, he says, there's many caring and loving people in the world who already know this and have known it for a long time. So why is it necessary? I thought that was a very interesting question, quite frankly, and one that I have actually wrestled with for some time, because I've often been asked, if we already know the answers to this, if we already have the scientific evidence for this information, why is it that science needs to continue? And what I'd like to share with you are some thoughts on why that's so. Because in our China project, we've barely begun. We're probably only about 1 to 2 or 3% or so at the most of the interpretation of the data that we now have. We have enough there to really lay the groundwork, I think, once and forever, in much detail about the justification for this particular idea as far as nutrition is concerned. The thought that has actually occurred to me has to do with the concept of experimental control. So bear with me if I can take you through this here. It's a very simple concept, actually. Maybe too simple, and I'm sure you're aware of it. But science likes to think it is very objective. It likes to think that it's precise. It likes to think, scientists tend to like to think that the evidence that they get is pretty firm. They're getting definite answers. But there is a notion about science that has bothered me for some time, and in fact it actually is the basis for the China Project in large measure. Namely, if you think about experimental control and treatment groups, if you will, that is to say, somebody has a hypothesis, or they have a product that they want to test, or an idea they want to test. As you know, very simply, from elementary school education, you know the best way to do that is to have a control group and the experimental group. And both groups, incidentally, are exactly identical. If there are individuals, for example, same age, same sex, more or less the same background as much as possible, so everything is equalized. While this person, this investigator, tests this one thing, or this one idea. The problem with that, and so they do it very well in many cases, perhaps they do it very honestly, and I think the majority of scientists, of course, are honest, and they do it honestly. They have some methods, and they test this to see what kind of result they actually get. And they report the results, whatever they are. The problem with that approach, and incidentally, this is the basis for rational science. It's the basis for empiricism, or the basis for empirical science that we've actually lived with for the last 200 or 300 years. And I'm going to suggest that we actually need some new thinking in this field, revolutionary thinking on this concept. Basically, when you have this control group and treatment group, even though everything is done precisely and just as accurately as one possibly can do it, on the one hand, the problem with that is somebody, the researcher, had to choose what to test. The researcher had to pick out something to test it. The researcher had to pick out beta-carotene to test it, or to pick out some food to test it, or the researcher had to pick out some particular mechanism to examine it, or some particular disease to look at. Now, if you think about that for a moment, the relationship between diet and disease, or diet and health, if you will, from the biological perspective is extraordinarily complex. It is so complex it's incomprehensible. There was a young man here from Mexico who was asking me just before, earlier this afternoon, about some particular, the identity of a particular chemical and what it could do or couldn't do that was present in meat, and there was a report that this particular chemical actually can inhibit cancer. And as we were talking, I think we both became aware that there's not 1,000 things in food that we can examine, or 2,000 or 5,000 or 10,000. There's probably billions of things in food. Billions of things in food. And as scientists, we've barely scratched the surface. And so when science gets together to pick out something to test, to put it in the treatment group as opposed to the control group, they have to make a selection. They have to pick out what it is that they want to test. That's where science breaks down. That's where rational science breaks down. That's where empiricism basically still stands, but the rational science breaks down. And as a result, maybe they picked out the wrong thing. They had to make a choice. They had to make a choice what to test. And I can assure you that most researchers tend to want to test the thing they're most familiar with. They tend to pick that thing that actually suits their own lifestyle. They're not likely to pick the one thing that's going to confront their own lifestyle, or to, let's say, upset the apple cart too much. Because if in fact they really do, they may not get continued funding, and they may not get continued publications. But nonetheless, they're forced to pick out this one thing. They're forced to focus their ideas really down to a gnat's heel, if you will. And so once they get these results, they report the results all honestly. And so this person gets this result, that person gets that result. And science now is so sophisticated in terms of statistics, in terms of methodology, that I can tell you that it's possible to design experiments these days, picking one thing out, testing it using some particular method, and getting almost any result you want. That is essentially possible. And so what feeds this process? There's all sorts of reasons that feed it. One thing is that people like to think very simplistically and simply. They'd like to know about the magic bullet. They want to know the newest discovery, the newest chemical, if you will, that can do this, that, or something else. And of course, that's one idea. The second idea is that's what sells. That's what gets money. That's what pays our research bills. That's what fuels science. And so as a result, we get all this tremendous amount of information just flowing forth and spread through the newspapers, and we get a lot of controversies and so forth and so on. What we are missing in the process is the big picture. Really, the big picture is what we really need. And that's what I'd like to share with you insofar as the China project is concerned, because that's the reason it was designed the way it was. It's somewhat unique, somewhat different, of course, than other kinds of studies, but it actually came about because I was interested at that time in the early 1980s to explore this idea, to try to get the big picture first. And then as we go along, we can fill in the strokes. We can sort of do the details and make sure it's all right. But keep in mind, and we'll get to this point toward the end, that in my view, what science needs to do is to figure out a way to establish the effects of a holistic diet. Incidentally, that word holistic is not very well accepted in science, hasn't been for hardly ever. I think it's getting a little more acceptable these days. But prior to now, the word holistic was not very well accepted. Instead, science, as I said, picked out the single things, and they did this highly reductionist sort of approach to trying to understand things and confuse themselves and everyone else in the process. So, if I can go to the slides, I want to show you first just a few, maybe I turn it on, okay. You all know this. That was obviously prominent since the 1950s, and it was the best evidence or best kind of recommendations, supposedly, that we came out from our government and other sort of agencies. About, as you can see, there's 4 food groups there, and about half are animal products and half are plant products, more or less. Most people, of course, put great emphasis on the consumption of animal products. So in actual fact, then and still now, I might tell you, about 70% of the total protein on average in this country comes from foods of animal origin. 70% on average. It's still more or less that way. So the American public actually bought into this idea, even went beyond this, and really has emphasized the carnivorous diet instead of the kind of diet that you're familiar with. In any case, this was the case in the late 70s. It's beginning to erode now to some extent, thanks to efforts of people like yourselves bringing it to the attention of the American public, but it still has a long ways to go. And of course, also during the late 70s, at that time, that I more or less got quite serious about this question, there was other kinds of evidence that showed that basically people got disease according to the kind of diet they ate, and furthermore, the kind of diet they ate suggested that eating plant material was better for you in terms of reducing certain kinds of important diseases. Here's, for example, a relationship between animal fat intake and breast cancer, as you can see for different countries, with the United States being near the top there, in the little yellow bit. You can see that the higher the animal fat intake, the higher the breast cancer risk. Incidentally, that does not prove that animal fat causes breast cancer. That's the reductionist kind of thinking, incidentally, I'm telling you that actually has been so misleading, because that takes things out of context. To take one thing like that and say, that's what does it, okay? But nonetheless, these kind of data were available that led researchers during the late 70s and on into the 80s and still today to conclude that dietary fat in the diet alone could control whether or not the disease occurred or didn't occur. So this is the relationship between animal fat intake and breast cancer. When we look at plant fat intake and breast cancer for these same countries, we don't see a relationship. Okay, so this points to the idea, in my view, not that it's animal fat that causes the problem, although it is a bit mischievous. It's not that. It's something about the animal-based diet that is causing the problem. And the story is, of course, much larger than that, as we all know now. And of course, the essential feature of those kinds of data is that when people move from one country to another, from, let's say, a high-risk country near the top of the graph to a low-risk country, or a low-risk country to a high-risk country for different cancers, they take on the risk of the country to which they move as they change their diets, and without changing their genes. In other words, they keep the same genes. They keep the same genes, and although I know we're genetically different, and I know we have different genetic susceptibilities perhaps at times, the point is, if you can change your diet, as these people have done and done hundreds of these kinds of studies now, as people change their diet, move to another area, change their diet, they get they get the disease of the country to which they move, and of course, accustomed to the diet they tend to use. So these data that I just mentioned to you, this kind of information was available in the 1970s, and finally in the late 70s and early 80s, the National Academy of Science convened a panel to basically study this literature, to see what was the relationship between diet and cancer. In those days, it was just emerging, for public consumption at least, the idea that diet has something to do with heart disease and lower fat diets are important, and so the National Academy of Science wanted to know what was going on with regards to cancer. That panel was convened. I was a member of the panel at the time. And one of the problems that arose in that panel at that time, and this was at the time the China study really started, one of the problems that arose in that panel was what I referred to before. As we looked at all the scientific data, and there were lots of data even then, there's probably 50 times as much now, as we looked at those data and summarized these results, we would put a chapter for protein, we'd put a chapter for fat, we'd put a chapter for fiber, we'd put a chapter for calories. We just operated within that realm because it was so convenient to do it that way. But then we concluded at the end that from all of this together, that we ought to eat more vegetables and fruits and grains, which I think was a decent recommendation, of course. We also said something else that was for political purposes, I have to tell you, and that was to basically get the fat intake down to 30% of calories from the more or less 38 to 40% of the average person. We thought that was an acceptable target, it was a practical target, and all that sort of thing. It's not near enough, as you well know. So, at the same time, what we also said, this panel said, nutrient supplements were not the answer. They were not the answer because that's the reductionist approach. And that's a dangerous approach. And unfortunately, it's an approach that's been widely publicized ever since this report in the early 1980s. To say basically that maybe, just maybe, we can leave our diets the same with all that stuff in it, add some nutrient supplements, and cure our ailments. It won't work. It just won't work. It's a highly reductionist approach. At best, we might see a little advantage here and there, but it's not going to last. Nature beats us at that. And the real question is, we got to make the wholesale change. The wholesale change in diet, I'm going to argue also the wholesale change in dietary lifestyle, the kind of things that you know so well. And so when we look at the question concerning diet, we've got to look at the diet in its wholesale or holistic way. Okay. So the China study emerged at that time, came as a result of a visitor from China, Dr. Chen Junshi, who I want to acknowledge here, who has since become a very close friend and colleague, who has been really an extraordinary scientist who has put together and organized this study in China, together with myself and all of our colleagues, and my colleague in the University of Oxford in England, Richard Pito, and Li Jianyao at the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences. In any case, in the early 1980s, the Chinese were just then reporting on the amount of cancer that occurred in different parts of the country in these beautiful color-coded maps, as you can see here. And so this is one for leukemia in men. And if you can look at the color code to the bottom left, maybe it's not so easy to see, but you can see where the red spots are. That's where leukemia is high. And of course, it's graded down through the purple and the orange and the green to the yellow. And so you can see that leukemia is a rather localized disease, geographically speaking. Oops, backwards, sorry. There it is for stomach cancer, rather different distribution. And so it was for about a dozen different cancers. And what these data really showed to the Chinese and to the world was that cancer was not, cancer wasn't evenly distributed around, as we could tell from the previous thing, higher cancers in some countries and lower in other countries. Here in China, we saw all in one country, these enormous differences between the cancer rates in different regions of the world. And in fact, these differences were so large and so dramatic, as is shown here, that it really was so striking. And what I want to call your attention to here are the range of mortality rates for men and women, okay, men on the left, women on the right, for about a dozen different cancers. And that range across 2,400 counties in China was enormous. We're looking here at a few dozen-fold ranges, maybe in a couple of cases a few hundred-fold ranges. In this country, if we see a 1.2 or 1.3-fold range from one part of the country to another, we never hardly see more than a 2-fold range at most. If we see a 1.2, 3 or 4-fold range, just a tiny bit, it makes headlines in the newspaper, creates all kinds of confusion, consternation, and that's all we ever see. In China, we're talking about a several dozen-fold range, a few hundred-fold range, a radically different situation. So it suggests that cancer is a local disease. And so it was if we got more data too. So is heart disease a local disease. So is diabetes a local disease. And on and on and on. And so what we did, of course, was to go to China and explore why was it that these diseases occurred in some places and not in others. And one of the nice things about the study at that time was the fact that the people lived in the same regions all their lifetimes. Basically, between 90 and 95% of the people in our study actually were born in the counties which they then lived at the time of the survey. Of course, they ate locally produced food. It was very different in different regions, but nonetheless, they ate locally produced food year in and year out. And so it was really ideal. I mean, it was an experiment in the making. So we then organized the study and did it. And before going on to some of the study design and the results, some of which you may have seen, let me call your attention to the so-called French paradox, or the Mediterranean paradox, that I think Dr. Goldhammer referred to today. You've heard that olive oil is pretty good, I think, that you can probably eat as much as you can, because in Greece and France and Italy and all, they consume these very high-fat diets with lots and lots of olive oil. And they talk about the reduction in heart disease and breast cancer rates in those countries. And what I want to call your attention to here, look at the United States and the UK, more or less there, and then look at Italy and Greece. And you can see that in this case, the breast cancer and similar data are available for other cancers too. You can see there appears to be a slight reduction in the rates of these diseases in those countries. And a lot is made of that. And so as a result, the olive oil industry has gotten very excited. They say, well, these people here are eating all this olive oil, and they see this reduction, so olive oil is good for you. Well, it turns out that in those countries, the ingestion of plant material is rather similar to what it was in rural China. Not too different. Not too different. Look how much higher it is in Greece and Italy than it is in China. I think the reason it's much higher there is because they're consuming all the olive oil. There's other problems too with it. I'm not going to argue that olive oil or monounsaturated fats are not better than saturated fats, and polyunsaturated maybe a bit better. But to add and dump in all that olive oil, anyhow, in those countries they weren't drinking olive oil like a lot of people tell us they were. They were actually using olive juice, which just happens to be fairly high in fat. So they were getting some, I mean, it's not the refined kind of olive oil that we buy in this country that has all that good stuff removed out of it. So the China data then are different. Rural China is very different from the Mediterranean situation, drastically different. And before now showing you the study design, let me point out what I mean by the China data, or the China project. The China project is listed in the top two entries there. It basically combines data from disease rate data from 1973 to 75, together with our survey of 1983 and 84. It involved 65 counties across the country. It involved 130 villages, or in other words, two villages in every county. And so those are the data that we've been playing with and talking about and getting some results that I'll show you in a moment. However, that was only the first phase. The second phase of the study is a 1986 mortality survey where we went back again and surveyed 100 million population to get much more refined data on disease rates. We also did another dietary and lifestyle data again, now in 170 villages rather than 130, and we've included Taiwan in the second round. We just about have these data in hand. This data set, the first data set was by far and away the most comprehensive ever conducted. The second data set is about 5 times larger than the first set. So by the time we get the second set together with the first set, we're really going to have enough data here for people to play with for years to come. Not just us, but for anyone who happens to be interested in this. And of course, then there were some other more focused, smaller studies that's come along the way. China, as you well know, is a vast country. It's the largest populated country in the world, in terms of population at least. There's a vast difference in geography across the country from southern China, the rice paddies, for example, to the far north, where some of the Muslims live and where they herd sheep and goats and some cattle. And so their diets are rather different. And so it gives us a chance to compare, if you will, the difference in disease rates and all kinds of other characteristics as far as these dietary and lifestyle practices are concerned. And so the survey was conducted. We measured lots of things. And as I say, thanks to Dr. Chen and his colleagues and a large number of Chinese people who were involved in doing this work. Some simple measurements like that, and blood pressure measurements were taken in the second survey, and urine collections Chinese colleagues were a little cautious how they took that picture. Didn't get the real thing, but we collected blood samples and urine samples and all sorts of things, and then analyzed them for all kinds of things having to do with nutrient characteristics. One of the characteristics of China that we had to take note of, and it's important, I think, is the fact that most people in China ride bicycles to work. And so they're getting exercise virtually every day. That's changing, incidentally, particularly in the cities, but nonetheless, bicycles are still used a lot and do play a role insofar as regular exercise is concerned. It's very clear. Okay, now for some of the characteristics. This slide here basically shows these 65 counties, some of the sort of characteristics of the counties, and to show you that they're vastly different across China. I actually rather naively thought that when I went to a socialist country in the early 1980s, that income would more or less be equalized and other things would more or less be the same. It wasn't. It really wasn't. There's vast differences between the country, among the counties in the country. You can see agriculture employment. And incidentally, this survey was mostly in the rural parts of China and the semi-rural parts of China. And so you can see agriculture employment ranged quite a lot, industrial employment, population density, all the way from the far northwestern part of the country near the Gobi Desert, or the nomadic people, to the area near Shanghai. Population density was dramatically different. Income, that's something was really surprising. I found that rather remarkable for a socialist country to see that much difference. Now it's even greater, of course. Okay, and this summarizes basically the kind of data we collected, because as I said before, the purpose of this study was to look at the relationship between diet and all the diseases we could get our hands on comprehensively, so that when we can make a recommendation about one disease, we're not trading it off for the information on another disease. And so in these 65 counties, you got 2 different villages, or communes as they were called in those days, and where there were 50 adults in each village, and we did a 3-day dietary intake. That is, we actually went into the homes of every one of these individuals and measured very carefully exactly what they ate of each and every different kind of food. And we could then calculate nutrient intakes, and we could record food intakes as a result of that. We administered questionnaires to all the people. They were between the ages of 35 and 64, incidentally. And those are people who get the cancers and heart disease, so we really wanted to know that. We wanted to know what did they really do with their lives in terms of diet and lifestyle practices and the like. We did blood samples, urine samples, as I mentioned before, analyzed them for a large number of different things, some food samples, and at the end of the day, and that was around 1991, we had in hand 367 items of information, dietary, lifestyle, and mortality information. Then we could begin to look, if you will, in sort of comprehensively in the aggregate of how these things all related one to another. This slide and the next one just shows some of the things we actually measured. We were particularly interested in nutrition. So here I just list all the different ways that nutrition was actually measured. We measured things in the blood. We measured things that was actually being consumed. In some cases, we measured things that were coming out in the urine in order to get a better feel for exactly what kind of nutritional status people really experienced. And then some other things. We measured contaminants in the food, things like pesticides and heavy metals and aflatoxin and smoking characteristics. We did an extensive study on smoking that subsequently has led actually to major laws now being adopted by the Chinese government to actually advise their citizens about the hazards of smoking. This is rather a nice achievement, I think. That's really, I have to credit to my colleague Richard Peter from the University of Oxford, because the United States companies, and as they have watched their decline in sales in this country, as you may know, have been going abroad and trying to dump their cigarettes, and they've been doing it in China too. And so it's rather nice to actually come in and undercut them away, if you will. A little bit of indication. Drinking water sources, anthropometry, geographic characteristics, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Okay, here are some results. And this basically just gives an overview of the summary of what rural China looks like in terms of nutrition compared to the United States. And basically, look at the top where in the words, it says the China project data, and incidentally, this is what was so unique and different from Western studies. Before you get on to the end of the sentence, if you will, Western studies mostly are focused on people in our country, not you guys, but most other people in this country who are consuming, mostly all of them, consuming fairly high-fat diets and fairly animal-rich diets. So the results they get are rather confusing. They're not really looking at the right crowd of people. So in China, basically the China Project data compared diets rich in plant foods with diets very rich in plant foods, both being beyond the changes called for in the United States dietary guidelines. So it really gives us an opportunity to look in that territory to see really what was going on, all the way down to veganism, if you will, virtually, or close to it. And so, comparing China and the United States, one of the first things we notice is rather interesting, is that in China, energy intake, you see at the top of the list there, kilocalories, energy intake was about 20-30% higher in China than here. That was a surprise to a lot of people. Most people thought the Chinese were starving. They're not. They're eating more than we are. Well, part of the reason for that, of course, is their bicycling and their exercise and things like that, because that's what drives energy intake to some extent, to a great extent. But also at the same time, a low-fat, much more vegetarian type of diet allows one to actually consume a bit more energy, burn it off the heat, not lay it down as body fat, and so it has that advantage. I just got reminded from Dr. Scott, no, I think it was Dr. Scott who told me, as I was going through the lunch line, be sure and get 2 plates because, you know, one tends to eat more of this kind of food, and that is so obvious. In China, you can see people are actually really heaping their plates up with lots and lots of plant food, and certainly it's more than what we tend to get here. Fat intake, as you can see, is much lower in China than the United States. These are just average figures. Fat intake, it actually ranges between 6% of calories to 24. Their high is almost below our low on average. Okay? Look on down the list. I want to draw your attention to the bottom line, animal protein, because that's one of my favorites. That's the unsung myth, or the unsung story, or untold story about the hazards of animal protein. But in any case, when animal protein intake is expressed as a percent of calories, as it should be, animal protein intake in the United States is about 10 times higher than it is in rural China. And I'm going to argue that's one of the major reasons, not just because of the animal protein, but because of the animal protein, all the other things that come along with it, and that therefore we don't get because we decide to eat that, if you will, is about 10 times higher in the United States than it is in China. Okay, now the next series of slides, and then basically more or less the remainder, what I want to show you is I tried to make this point in the beginning about reductionist science, looking at one thing and not paying attention to the whole picture. What we tried to do here in this next series of slides, and have been doing for the years since our data were available to us, is to try to look at the question concerning what happens when we sort of compare these diets, from the very rich plant diets to the slightly rich plant diets, if you will. There's so many different ways we can compare that relationship. I mean, there's almost infinite ways. And so I'm going to show you just a sort of snapshot of some of these different ways. And it turns out every time we look, essentially, every time we look, as you probably well know, and there's many ways, there's so many ways to look, and every time we tend to look, it turns out the closer one gets to an all-plant-based diet, the healthier they are. It's that simple. And of course, that is not news to you, but it is terribly provocative to the established nutrition research communities. It means we're basically going to have to rewrite our textbooks because of information of this sort. Blood cholesterol levels also are really off the scale as far as we're concerned in the United States. In China, it ranges from 90 milligrams per deciliter up to about 170, in rural China at least. They're actually increasing now as they're becoming more capitalized, if you will. Their high is near our low. And so that's an important point to keep in mind, because since the cholesterol level is already down to 170, a lot of doctors in this country will tell you, as you know, that that's low enough. To go lower than that, you might run into mischief. Well, we are interested to see whether or not, if you went from 170 down lower, whether or not disease rates also tended to change. We don't get that chance much in these other kinds of studies. So it was a nice opportunity to take a look at that. The bottom number there, body mass index, as you can see, that's a reflection of body fat or obesity, sort of related to obesity prevalence. In China, people are not fat. You rarely see fat people, except in the own cities you're starting to see obese people. It's becoming a significant problem, particularly for some children, as people get richer. Okay, now there are different ways to look at this question concerning the comprehensive effects of diet on all these different diseases, and I just mentioned one. That is to look at all these different ways. There's another way, and this slide and the next one shows you that. What we tried to do here was simply to look at all the diseases around the country, simply to see if there were any particular groups of disease, geographically speaking, And we had a technique of doing that. And it turns out that we end up with two groups of disease shown here, Group A and Group B. And so the rule here, for those of you familiar with, science, with these kind of techniques, every entry in either list is positively correlated with diseases in its own list and inversely correlated with disease in the opposite list. So these are naturally segregated diseases. It says that these two groups of diseases have some common causes with each other. In other words, the causes for one group are rather different from the causes from the other group. So it gives us a chance to ask the question and explore the data to see what happens. And if you look on the right, there's the cancers and heart disease and diabetes, the kind of disease that kill about 60 to 70% of us in this country before our time. On the left side, you get the infectious diseases. And so now we can ask ourselves, well, what is causing these two different diseases to emerge that way? I'm particularly interested, of course, in the ones on the right that obviously are related to what we're doing in this country. And it turns out that the distinction between these two groups is that communicable diseases on the left is basically associated with pre-industrialization, nutrient deficiencies, poor countries, that sort of thing. On the right, they used to be called disease of nutritional, or disease of affluence. I'd rather like that term there, disease of nutritional extravagance. I think it's more appropriate for what's really happening. But basically, it comes along with industrialization in most societies. When they get more money and they eat more food and they eat the wrong kind of food, and of course it's involved with rich countries. So now what's the relationship? Surprisingly, even though cholesterol is already low in China, supposedly at 170 milligrams per deciliter, it turns out that's the chief correlate of those diseases of nutritional extravagance. And that value right there, which is highly significant, which in turn is related to the consumption of meat, milk, and eggs, that value basically says that as people increase their cholesterol levels from around 90 to 100 or so, on up the scale to 160, 170, these diseases start to emerge. They start to emerge. And cholesterol, in turn, the level of cholesterol in the blood is related to, of course, what you're eating, primarily to animal protein intake, to dietary fat intake, lack of fiber, and all the other sorts of things that are characteristic of animal versus plant foods. So these data here were actually used to actually create quite a lot of discussion. The paper on that, I'm really kind of pleased to say, we shared authorship, of course, with our Chinese colleagues, particularly with a senior person in China who's responsible for dietary guidelines, a woman who was really a very impressive woman, who has actually taken this to heart and trying to argue that the Chinese should not be introducing the Western kind of diet just because of a data like this. In addition, I was also advised a couple of years ago that President Suharto of Indonesia, the fourth most populous country in the world, who at the time was devising nutritional guidelines for the future, because now they're getting more money because of oil production in Indonesia. They're devising dietary guidelines. And so they have been told by Western scientists and Western industrialists that what they needed to do most was to introduce the Western diet. And so the United States Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Embassy were going there and bringing livestock authorities and dairy authorities and trying to introduce livestock into Indonesia, breeding cattle to do this sort of thing. Well, President Suharto actually got access to these data, or some paper or somebody told him about him, and he actually gave a fairly major speech in Jakarta and argued that somebody ought to take a look at these data, because if this is true, then Indonesia ought to be changed in their national policies. So I was invited to go, and I met with the ministers, and we talked it over. And the week after I was there, I might add, there was a big USDA fair put on that Jakarta was also invited to, and he had to give a talk. And so he had a chance in back-to-back weeks to hear my story and then hear USDA's story. And they were, of course, telling, to introduce livestock and dairy. About 2 months later, the Indonesian ministries actually changed their policies to this story here. They basically said that taking the Western model, introducing livestock and dairy was not the way to go. That what they needed to do was to maintain their traditional diet, mostly plant-based, and go with that particular route. So we were kind of pleased with that result from these data. Correlations of plasma cholesterol. You can see that the top three things, the pluses, of course, indicate a positive relationship. The minuses, an inverse relationship. In other words, what happens here is as fat intake goes up, as animal protein intake goes up, and as meat goes up, it increases cholesterol. And as fiber and cellulose and legumes go up, they decrease cholesterol. That's the minus number, okay? So what it really is saying is that as soon as these animal foods are put into the diet, and the Chinese don't eat much, But they put in a little bit as you start looking at different counties. As they start putting animal foods in the diet, cholesterol starts going up and all the other starts to change, and these diseases start to appear. And to me, that is the kind of evidence, in fact, we haven't had before, that really puts a rather impressive story, I think, on the whole notion that the closer one gets to veganism, the better off they're going to be. Plasma cholesterol is also positively associated with most cancer mortality rates. Well, that sort of follows from what I more or less just said. The dietary protein thing is something that's intrigued me for years. We have actually done work on that for many years. And what we find is that animal protein, incidentally, when we talk about protein, there's one point I really need to make and emphasize. One should not talk about just dietary protein. There's a major difference between animal proteins in general and plant proteins in general. Major difference. They have opposite effects. Animal protein tends to turn on cancer rate growth. Animal protein increases cholesterol. Animal protein increases the loss of calcium from the kidneys, if you will, from the bones. Plant protein has the opposite effect. Plant protein and the other things that come along with it in general. It decreases cholesterol. It slows down heart disease. It slows down cancer. And so here is some data to show that point. You look at the kind of cholesterols, the total cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, the LDL, ApoB is more or less bad. You see pluses and minuses? The pluses indicate that as animal protein intake goes up, these kind of cholesterols, the bad cholesterol goes up. It's not good enough just to take out some fat to hope to get, or cut down to saturated fat to get rid of to reduce your blood cholesterol. One has to go the whole way to really see significant changes. Breast cancer, another way to look at these data. Breast cancer mortality in China is associated positively with dietary fat intake and plasma cholesterol and inversely with age at menarche. It's an interesting concept, incidentally. Age at menarche is a strong predictor of breast cancer later in life, as you probably know. In this country, age at menarche is around 11, 12 years of age for young girls. And it's a strong predictor of breast cancer, as I said. In China, age at menarche is between 15 and 19 years on average. And what really happens in this story is that a girl that is actually pushed, and I would suggest also for young boys too for other reasons, but a girl whose growth rate is pushed by a nutritionally rich diet, lots of protein, lots of animal protein, lots of fat, we tend to push our children as fast as we can to get them growing as fast as we can. That is a mistake. Because what happens is that it speeds up the appearance of menarche, which in turn then translates later in life to an earlier onset of breast cancer. And so the whole breast cancer story is related to early life nutrition throughout life, essentially. Okay, just to look at another relationship. Here's heart disease or cardiovascular diseases, and we have different kinds of heart diseases we can look at in China. Cardiovascular diseases are associated with the risk factors usually seen at higher plasma cholesterol levels, especially green vegetable intake and that bad cholesterol. That's what that term really means. The latter being associated with meat and animal protein. In other words, what we're basically saying there from these data, and these are all published stuff now, is that heart disease behaves just like cancer. As soon as people start putting in animal foods into the diet, increasing their cholesterol, increasing plasma urine nitrogen, all these other things, and everything else is going wrong, then heart disease starts to appear too. If cancer doesn't get them, heart disease is going to, or diabetes is going to. So these all kind of go together. And then antioxidants, you've heard about that, so we had a look at that as well. We got a lot more to look at, but it turns out that antioxidant levels, especially vitamin C and beta-carotene in the blood, are inversely associated with several cancers. Colorectal cancers, same thing. Once the higher the fiber intake, in other words, the more plant-based it is, the lower the colon cancer rates. Okay, so now to summarize. This is just a number of different ways, and we have many, many more that I could show you. Every time we look at this question, we see these relationships. And what I want to say is this. I don't want to say that a high fiber intake is going to reduce colon cancer. There's hundreds of different kinds of fibers, maybe thousands. And I don't know which one does what, and no one else does either. All I can say is that a high fiber diet increases colon cancer rates. That's only an indication. That's a small piece of the big picture. Do you understand what I'm really saying? I can say that high fat diets tend to be associated with cancer and heart disease. But I don't want to say the fat alone does it, because that means we can just take out the fat and leave everything else the same and get some results. We can't do that. It's only an indication. Beta-carotene intake and vitamin C intake, yes, they're good. They're great. And they only come from plants. But I don't want to say beta-carotene alone is going to do the job, because it doesn't. You may have heard of the beta-carotene supplement trial from Finland recently, where in fact, when people who were taking beta-carotene supplements, lung cancer rates actually went up. It's very, very troubling to those who in fact have bet their last dollar on the nutrient supplement industry. The fact of the matter is, these are indications. These are indicators. And when you put the whole story together, that's when we begin to see, you know, this question concerning vegetarianism. That's when it just sort of starts looming large and telling us really what we ought to be looking at. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. So I actually call it a hypothesis. We have to do that in science. I didn't call it a conclusion, because if I said a conclusion, I mean, I get run out of most halls as far as science is concerned. We always have to call this a hypothesis. And I do have to say that, I'll save my remarks on that to my transparency, but I want to say that the evidence is that you see, the richer the diet is in the kinds of amounts of nutrients provided by foods of plant origin, the lower is the risk for chronic degenerative diseases. And so there's a couple of corollaries to that. There is no threshold of plant food richness beyond which further health benefits are not achieved. That is to say, you can't get enough plant foods as far as enrichment is concerned. The closer you get to an all-vegan type of diet, the better off you're going to be, period. Okay? Another corollary. The closer the foods of plant origin are to their native state, that is with minimal cooking and salting and processing, in other words, the sort of organic foods, the clean foods that Alan was talking about earlier, the greater will be their benefit-risk ratio. Okay, so it basically makes an argument from the best evidence we have that the better quality foods, minimal processing, you know that so well. I mean, we just came from the cafeteria that we're doing it right. Corollary 3, the greater the variety of foods. This is a really important point here, and it sometimes is missed. And the reason that there needs to be variety, the greater the variety, not of all foods, but just plant foods. The greater the variety of these foods, the better we're going to be, because, and this is what third world countries haven't done, even though they eat plant foods mostly, they have a lot of communicable diseases. The reason they have communicable diseases is not because they're eating plant foods. It's a good thing they are. The problem is they're only eating just very minimal, only one or two, very, very monotonous, just one or two or three different kinds of foods. In many of these cases, not enough. And so they suffer nutritional deficiencies. And so we have to have lots of variety to make sure that we cover all of our bases. And that's also why nutrient supplements tend not to work. We need to have a wholesome diet, lots of variety, good quality, and plant-based in order to get the results that we really want. And in this case here, if we follow that rule, along with the other rules, then we can reduce both the communicable diseases that we see in third world countries and the chronic diseases we tend to see in Western countries, at least until, let's say, 80, 90, 100 or so. And we could sort of clean up, I think, some of the mess that exists in disease in the world. Okay, let me show you then, just to come back to this point about reductionist science. I actually rather like M. Scott Peck, and some of you may know him, who wrote Further Along the Road Less Traveled and 2 or 3 books now. And I think he said it so well. It says, "Seek and you shall find enough pieces of truth to be able to start fitting them together. You will never be able to complete the puzzle, but you will be able to fit together enough pieces to begin to get glimpses of the big picture and to see that it is very beautiful indeed." I think that's the message that science needs to work towards. And that we have enough information now to know with some degree of considerable certainty that being a vegetarian is it. That's where it is really at. I mean, there's 80 to 90% of the people in the country don't believe that necessarily, and that's where science comes in. Because this is what I want to say here, and why science is important. The scientific institutions of today are not doing a very good job, as I pointed out before. In fact, I think they're doing a very poor job. It's skewed. They're not examining relationships as they should examine the relationships. And as a result, since investigators can pick, if you will, pick and choose whatever they want to study, And now, since the methodologies are so powerful and so able to be orchestrated and organized, now it's possible for investigators to keep on finding reasons why vegetarianism is not what we should do, or keep on finding reasons why the good old American diet is more or less okay, or keep on finding reasons if we stick in a little bit of this or a little bit of that or take out something else, it's okay. There are so many opportunities for science to keep on doing this. And until we start really using science that it should be used, to explore it as nature provided it, explore these relationships that way, and really put all this big picture together so that those people who come along and chip away with all these little detailed observations and try to destroy the message, until we get this big picture clearly in place and well articulated and be able actually to answer some of these questions they raise, then, only then, will we be able to begin to progress this message that needs to be progressed. It's not enough for you and I to know that this is the way to go. That's not enough. What we need to do is to actually extend this message to others. We need to break the ice, provide the information so that others, even the greatest skeptics in the world, can start looking at it, even like President Suharto, and saying, yeah, that's what I want. Now I'm convinced. Now I know where the confusion comes from. Now we must change. And that's the issue that we next need to address. I want to tell, just so you don't know my own biases, this is actually another special occasion for me, in a way. Being here at Georgetown University, I actually was raised on a dairy farm and milked cows until I was 21, and we had lots of all that good food. We had a garden too, incidentally, thanks to my mother. I worked my way actually through college, having come from the farm and eaten, as I say, that kind of food, actually going to high school just across the street over here at Western High School. And so, in a sense, I'm coming home, in a sense, and I just wanted to show this whole picture. That was the way that I'm sitting there in the front with my brothers and my mother and some others, working and actually living on the farm and doing it. So when I went away to school, I actually went to veterinary school and then later got in to do my PhD, and believe it or not, I actually did my PhD in animal nutrition on animal protein to try to figure out how we could grow more animal protein more efficiently to feed more of the world. I finally, just only about 2 months ago, finally got an opportunity to go back to my old department of animal science and tell them about these new data, because they no longer could stand the nonsense that I was talking about. So it has come full circle, especially coming back to Georgetown and just being across the street where I went to high school. I think the story here is a long ways to go. Science needs to do what it should do, what it was designed to do, not what it's doing. And I would ask you to really try to appreciate what science can do. Demand more of science, because I know you can use science, but know what is doing wrong and argue for what it should be doing right. In our China data, for example, we have yet now still 95 to 98% of the data to be sort of interpreted, published. It takes time, it takes funds, of course, and so we must do that in order to try to put this full story together so that we can actually talk to our transitional vegetarians, talk to those people who really want to know what this is about, and convince them. And one of the ones, if Jim doesn't mind my saying so, we've actually started a newsletter to try to tell some of these sort of wrinkles about this story, and the funds from that project is actually going back into an endowment at the to be used for that purpose, to further this China project data, as well as to expand this information into the territory where we can actually help to establish policy in this area around the world. Thank you very much.
The American Natural Hygiene Society teaches people how to maximize their health potential by living in harmony with nature. The society, which is dedicated to health education, is the oldest national vegetarian organization in the United States. Its motto, "Healthcare is Self-Care," is a reminder that health is the result of healthful living. For more information about the American Natural Hygiene Society, its award-winning publication Health Science Magazine, and for a complete list of all the Society's books and tapes, call 855-6607. Or write, American Natural Hygiene Society, P.O. Box 30630,